All right, hello and welcome to our first lecture for week 3. This corresponds with chapter 6 in our textbook. This section is on the basic elements of planning and decision making, the first of the management functions, the 4 management functions that we're going to cover over the next 4 weeks. Things that we'll cover in this lecture include the essential functions of decision making itself and the planning process. Goals, why do we set them? Who sets them? How do we manage them, especially if there's conflict? The different kinds of plans and the importance of something called contingency planning. It's always good to have a backup. Uh, we will also discuss something called tactical plans. Tactical plans being sort of like the battle plan, the plan for the battle versus the plan for the war, which is strategy. We'll dive into that in a couple seconds here. The basic types of operational plans used by organizations, and the main barriers to goal setting and planning, and how to overcome these barriers as a manager within your organization, and how to use goal setting to implement plans as a manager. So, what is decision making? The first of our managerial activities. It is essentially the cornerstone of planning. It's the planning is the decision making that happens before events begin to unfold. It's what drives the decision planning process and is really you might say that decision making is the main thing that we do as managers in our jobs, is we are responsible for making decisions. Generally, those are decisions related to the allocation of resources to our environment, having discussed the analysis of external environment last week. As it says there, the planning that we make is the making decisions within an environmental context and mapping those resources to that context, matching them to that context. And then there's this other concept of something called a mission. You may have heard of things like mission statements. Your organization may have a mission statement that you are familiar with, and that a mission is essentially a statement of the organization's purpose. What do we exist to do as an organization? Pretty much every organization out there is going to have some kind of mission statement. Sometimes they call it a values statement. I think Apple has a values statement rather than a mission statement. But this is the really highest level picture of the organization, the highest level view of, okay, in general, what direction do we want to be moving in? That's really what the mission statement is, and it informs the goals and the plans that will be part of the strategy, tactics, and operational plans. I've got an outline here of a planning process. Now, it looks really confusing because the arrows are running all different ways. If we were to say what direction conceptually it runs, well, oops, sorry, let me erase that. Essentially, based on our mission and the environment that's around the organization here, this is sort of our external environmental context. We have a mission, possibly expressed in a mission statement, possibly just uncodified, but nevertheless embodied in the minds of our top management team. And it's composed of purpose, premise, values, and directions that will inform some strategic goals. Once we have these goals, we begin to formulate something called a strategic plan. And that strategic plan will lead to sub-goals, the steps we identify as needed to implement that plan, which will lead to tactical goals, sort of the smaller sub-goals as part of the strategy. Our strategic goal may be to grow our market share by 5%, but to do that, we'll have smaller tactical goals. Perhaps that means we want to increase the reach of our social marketing by a certain amount. To achieve that sub-goal then, that tactical goal, we'll need a tactical plan. Okay, well, what channels are we going to use to increase our social media engagement? Are we going to focus on Facebook, or are we going to focus on TikTok or whatever? Those tactical plans then will feed into our lowest level, which is the operational goals. Once we've decided, say, okay, we want to increase our overall social media engagement, which is going to drive our market share. Okay, well, and we've decided on TikTok as our primary mode of increasing social media engagement. Then we have some sub-operational goals. Okay, well, we're going to need to hire some influencers and get them to produce a certain type of content, which then leads to our operational plans. So There is a conceptual flow here that runs this way through the planning process, but additionally, uh, the fact of the matter is that at each stage here, we receive feedback. These are little feedback loops. So we make a plan, and then we say, actually, now that we've thought about it and made a plan, we realized perhaps the initial goals aren't feasible, or there's something else we think we can add to these. So those maybe feed back into our mission. Uh, or maybe we get to the tactical goals and we say, actually, these tactical goals, now that we think about it, maybe they conflict a bit or they aren't completely encompassed in our mission statement. So maybe we actually need to amend our mission statement based on some new information. Essentially, each of these steps is going to generate new information. And at any one of these points, that information might need to feed back into here, and we may need to go back, or it may just feed back into our strategic goals, our operational goals. We may find out it puts some constraints on our strategy, so we need to amend our strategic goals. As you can see here, essentially every single node in this network, if you think of it as a network, can feed back to any other node. So at any point, we can essentially go back up a level and try again. So perhaps there's just a minor hiccup in our operational planning, so we need to go back up to our tactical planning, think it through again, and come back around. Maybe it's a major hiccup, and we need to go all the way back to our strategic plan or even back to our mission and values and say, actually, now that we've tried this out, we don't think it is in alignment with our mission. So we're either going to have to change that plan or we're going to have to change our mission to match the operational reality. So this is the default path conceptually, if this isn't too messy now. However, the fact of the matter is any one of these nodes can result in going back to, it's essentially going back to the drawing board, if this is our drawing board. Hopefully that makes sense. So each of these stages involves the setting of goals. Now, I think we all understand what a goal is at the most broad level, but why set them? Even though we all understand them and generally think it's good to engage in goal setting, and oftentimes, even if we don't specify them, we tend to have goals, even if they're not stated explicitly or well considered. What other benefits or purposes does goal setting serve? Well, they provide guidance and unity to the organization. If we can't be going in the same direction if we haven't decided where we want to go. If as an organization we don't have a unified overarching goal, then at points of decision making, we may come up with conflicting answers because we don't agree on which direction we're even headed. There's other aspects of planning. Setting the goals informs the planning. Again, the plan is sort of like the chosen route about how to get somewhere. When I moved to Thibodaux, I charted a course from Calgary, Alberta to Thibodaux, Louisiana, and there were, say, 3 reasonable routes we could have taken and a couple more less optimal routes, but we chose the route we did as a sort of optimization between goals that we had for the quickest route, but also for some sightseeing and visiting some relatives. So there were a few sub goals we had as part of our overall strategic goal to get to Thibodaux, and so that informed parts of what you might call the tactical and operational planning. Having specific goals, and especially ones that are a bit of a stretch, can motivate employees. If you give someone a goal that will require 0 effort, you are unlikely to get very impressive performance. If you set a target for yourself to achieve a D in this course, you may achieve it, but it won't produce any particular motivation, I suspect. Moreover, goals provide a fairly measurable way of evaluating performance. If you've set a goal, now, of course, that assumes that the goal is measurable, which effective goals should have some way of measuring achievement. Once you've set that goal, you can look back, say, at the end of a business cycle or a year in an annual employee review, and evaluate the success of yourself or of other employees that you manage in achieving those goals. So they provide a good measuring stick in that sense. There's an example here about how this whole process and hierarchy of goals and sub-goals might play out in, for example, a fast food restaurant. So at the top here, you have the overall mission statement, which is to operate a chain of restaurants that will prepare and serve high quality food on a timely basis at reasonable prices. So you have a quality statement, an efficiency statement about time, and what later we'll talk about as something of a strategy statement about who we want to target. We want to target this reasonable price niche of the market or segment of the market. It's not a niche, it's going to be a pretty big segment of the market. So this mission statement then is handed down to the CEO, who decides on different ways to implement this, different strategic aspects of a strategic plan. We're going to provide 14% return to investors for 10 years. We're going to start and purchase new restaurant chain within 5 years. So we're going to make an acquisition or else start a new restaurant, and we're going to negotiate a new labor contract. These goals are then fed down to other members of the executive team here, vice president of operations, marketing. These are just different functions in an organization. I'm going to try and get my little pencil here just a second. Oh, the pencil has disappeared. Oh, here we go. Let's see here. So these are different functional areas in the organization that would, and again, this is what you'd see generally speaking is the board, the governing board, and this of which the CEO is usually the chair or the leader of that governing board, would set the mission and the strategic goals. Then your vice presidents might have some say in that. They might be part of, say, an executive committee, but they're really then part of what you would call the tactical goals. Okay, we've been given our mission of opening up 150 new purchasing new restaurants and giving a 14% return. Now we're going to set some sub goals here and some planning at a slightly more focused level. If you think about it sort of being the widest possible level of focus as the mission statement, each step we're kind of zoning in on a smaller area of responsibility. And then at the sort of middle management, you really have these operational goals. These, or even line management, you would say. So this is probably more like middle management, some of it, although it's a lot encompassed here in the tactical field. But once you get down to operations, you're really talking about what's called line management. If you want to think about it, you're on the front line. You're making those decisions about, okay, who do I want to hire or fire in my individual McDonald's chain as a restaurant manager? How am I going to schedule my employees? How am I going to improve the efficiency of our one store? Then maybe we'd have someone in charge of advertising in the central office who's looking at a marketing campaign and looking at the specifics of that marketing campaign. Rather than setting broad goals, these are sort of broader goals here being set at the tactical level. These are just down here, the bread and butter operational decisions. We're going to negotiate a better contract with our advertising partner. And then here you have some really, again, granular levels of decision making with maybe an accounting manager. I'm going to implement a new accounting software. This isn't really a strategic decision. It's a decision about that is related to how we're going to achieve the goals I've been given from my finance director. My finance director has given me tactical decisions, tactical goals related to the overall strategy. That's fed down here, and that's fed down to me, and I'm making the day-to-day decisions as an accounting manager about how to carry that out. And then when you get to the line staff, they're essentially just doing what they're told. They're delivering the product on the line. Hopefully you can see how this, in some senses, is a visualization of this first graph playing out across time. Oh, I guess I better delete that annotation here so it doesn't stick with us. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but I'll have to figure that out. Maybe the garbage can. Right. So as we mentioned, there's a few different levels of goal setting, the mission statement, the broadest general direction for the firm. This would be unlikely to change. Each of these levels of goals also tends to correspond to a time horizon, starting at a very long time horizon. The mission statement would be unlikely to change very regularly, right? We're not going to change the purpose of our organization every year. We're not going to be a fast food restaurant one year and a tire sales company the next year. But it might evolve over a lengthy time. Strategic goals might be set on, say, a 5-year basis, or longer or shorter, depending on the nature of our business. Tactical goals might be amended even more regularly. We have our 5-year strategy, and then maybe we update our tactical goals every year as we progress towards that strategy, sort of as milestones. And then our operational goals would be set and changed the most regularly as we carry out the day-to-day or shorter term issues of our plan. Let's see if this works. There we go. Cleared them all at once. Okay. Different functional areas of our firm will have different goals. So when I say functional areas, this is sort of like if you looked at an organizational chart, going horizontally across the chart, you would see an operations function, a marketing function, a finance function, maybe some quality control if we're in manufacturing. HR would be in pretty much every organization. So each of these different functional areas will have some kind of goals at the tactical and operational level. And as I said, there'll also be a time component to each of these goals. Long-term goals tend to be our strategic goals. Intermediate term will tend to be the tactical ones. And then our shortest term goals will tend to be those operational ones because hopefully if we're implementing our strategy effectively, we're meeting our short-term, well, our operational goals fairly regularly and setting new operational goals so we achieve our operational goals, our short-term goals, which eventually lead to the achievement of tactical goals or intermediate term goals, which eventually hopefully lead to the overall achievement of our long-term goal, say once every 5 or 10 years. And then maybe we start a new planning cycle, a new strategic long-range planning cycle for the next 5, 10 years, etc. Good. So who sets the goals in an organization? Well, in one sense or another, if you are a manager, you're setting goals in one form. It's at some level you're setting a goal as a manager. That's really what managers do, because if you're a manager, then by definition you're managing people or resources, and you are planning the allocation of those resources, whether they be people, financial, tangible, intangible. However, the nature of those goals, whether they're strategic, tactical, or operation, is going to depend on where you sit in the organization. So you will be setting goals that correspond to your level within the organization. You may also have to manage multiple goals, and sometimes goals conflict. You may have a goal for maybe the most common conflict between goals is the conflict between a desire to grow quickly and a desire for profitability. Sometimes you'll hear the expression, if you're in sales, you'll say, oh, usually you're saying it about your opponents, you'll say, or your competitors, you'll say, oh, those guys are buying market share. And what you mean is they're dropping their prices so low that they're gaining customers. Usually you're complaining because they're taking some of your customers at such a reduced price that you assume it must be at a loss. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But all that to say that the goal of growing your market share often comes at the cost of your profitability or your per unit profitability. When you hear about things like predatory pricing, that's when firms will drop their prices below cost just to get customers exposed to their product or hooked on their product. So those goals can conflict. Other goals might have to do with a desire to have a very high quality of inputs versus a more affordable product, or very high quality of craftsmanship versus timely delivery. There's always conflicts between good and reasonable goals. As you would even know from your own personal life, my goal to be in great shape and go to the gym may conflict with my need to be at my desk or with my family, right? They're all good goals to have, but they need to be optimized. And what that really means is deciding what's the best balance and what's the best way to reconcile possible conflicts among these goals. And one of the toughest things to do as a manager is make these decisions. You also might just call it simply prioritization. Let's practice my mouse writing skills here. Prioritization. There. It's not very pretty, but that would be another word for optimizing, is just prioritizing the conflicts and goals. And sometimes that might mean excluding one goal pursuing one goal at the exclusion of another. Perhaps you need to pursue one particular segment of the market. You decide you're going to focus specifically on one geographic region at the expense of another geographic region, just because you have limited resources. If we didn't have limited resources, we could do everything all at once, and we'd be living in the Garden of Eden. My economist friend often says, no scarcity. Right. So different kinds of plans. Well, the different kinds of plans correspond to each of the different levels of planning. We've looked at this already in the graph, and in the example from the fast food industry. So I'm not going to dive into it too much, but it's here if you want to review for the quizzes. Each of these levels of planning corresponds, generally speaking, with a time frame. So each level up corresponds with a longer time horizon. One thing worth noting here, when you get into short-range planning, you will likely have things called action plans as well as reaction plans. Strategy should really never be reactive. If you're having a reactive strategic plan, something's going wrong. Strategy is about charting your own course and making decisions about where you want to go. Now, the reality of that is that once you get down to, say, the operational level, things can go wrong. You might hit a crisis. And so when you're just implementing your chosen strategic plan, that is what you might call an action plan. When you're reacting to something that's gone wrong, that's more of a reaction plan. So let's say you released a product, a piece of software, and it's got a security bug. Well, now you have to put together a reaction plan to respond to that unforeseen event. Or perhaps there's a hurricane, very relevant here in South Louisiana. Now you have to have a reaction plan. Although in South Louisiana, you probably have an action plan as well. We'll talk about contingency planning, but essentially reacting to something that has happened rather than setting your own plan with sort of a blank slate, a blue sky sort of planning scenario. There's nothing wrong with reaction plans, but if you're always doing reaction planning, it may suggest that you need to devote more resources to your planning function or deal with whatever's causing you to be constantly in a state of reaction. Another discussion about responsibilities for planning. Where does it happen in the organization? Well, of course, we mentioned that it happens at different levels of the organization. The board of directors, chaired usually by the chief executive officer, the CEO. But there will also be often support staff. So planning staff is often related, will often help support that planning. They'll facilitate it. They may have various area specialists that help support planning across the organization and can maybe offer information, offer statistics, and just support planning at each level. So these would be sort of like a permanent planning office. These are getting less popular now. Sometimes you see organizations cutting their permanent planning staff and moving more towards what's called a planning task force. The difference here being planning task forces tend to be assembled and composed of individuals who have duties outside of simply planning. Although it can include full-time planning staff, it will also include, say, line managers or individuals with operating responsibilities, as well as purely planning. And usually a task force, as the name kind of implies, will be assembled to address a particular issue. You often hear about this in politics. There'll be a task force to address the COVID pandemic, or a task force to address the opioid crisis, or something like that. It tends to be issue related, or it often is issue related. And I would also say often temporary, although sometimes they can become permanent, especially in the case of government. Government initiatives almost always end up becoming permanent. Nobody wants to give up their job once they've started. Board of directors is really in charge at the top level of establishing the mission and strategy with the CEO, and then monitoring. The CEO reports to the board of directors, and the board of directors represent the shareholders in the organization. CEO is usually president of that board. You hire a CEO to make the strategic plan. That's why they get paid the big bucks. How are you going to save our organization, right? Starbucks just hired a new CEO and their stock, their market capitalization, the total value of all their stock went up by $30 billion, which was a reflection of people's faith in the strength of this CEO's strategic planning ability, really, is what they're putting their faith in. When you hire a CEO, a new CEO, you're hiring someone who you hope will give you a new strategy. Sort of like the CEO is sort of like the general in the army. The executive committee is the CEO's team that helps him implement this strategy and even helps him formulate it, provides input. They know their areas of expertise or their functional areas. Your marketing VP will help the CEO when it comes to marketing plans. Operations will help the CEO with operational plans, finance, etc. And then your line management. They're the ones actually having to execute this plan. And if you don't have some way of getting information from the line, you're going to be in trouble, because you might have a great plan at the top of the organization, but if it's not working at the line, that strategic plan isn't going to be worth the paper it's written on. I think there's a quote from Winston Churchill. He says, strategy is great, but every once in a while you check to see if it's working. That's when you need to be talking to your line management. And oftentimes very famous CEOs and some of the best CEOs are known for actually visiting and being in regular contact with line management. There was a CEO of a rail line, CP Rail, before that a US rail company called Hunter Harrison, that was famous. He started on the line, and even as CEO, he would just travel around the country on the rails, just seeing, okay, what's the real state of affairs here? That's where you're getting the information on the ground. Contingency planning. What happens? What do we do about crises? Crises, in some sense, are inevitable. Unforeseen events are inevitable. Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush, I think he was the Secretary of State. I can't remember, but he was kind of the architect of the Iraq War. And he famously said, we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And that's really, in some senses, where contingency planning comes into practice. Those known unknowns and unknown unknowns, which are the trickiest of all. What do we do if something happens? Something that we foresee. There's a hurricane in South Louisiana. We don't know when that's going to happen, but statistically speaking, you can guess about the probabilities and decide that you definitely need to have a plan for that eventuality. And so you need to plot out alternative courses of action. Sort of a plan, it's a plan B. Your contingency plan is a plan B. We have plan A, which is our ideal scenario, but if things happen, if things don't go the way we've hoped they'd happen, what do we do as plan B? And then crisis management is similar, but whereas this might relate to more predictable, this is sort of our hope for the best and plan for the worst is our contingency planning. Crisis relates more to, I would say, unforeseen events that can be a bit more disastrous. The COVID pandemic, in some senses, was more of a crisis. And what do we do? And it's also talks, this is more about the operational side of it. When that thing happens, how do we put this contingency plan into operation in a situation of crisis? This is the management part rather than the planning part. This happens beforehand, crucially, and this tends to happen during and after an event has occurred, a crisis has occurred. This is an example of planning with contingency planning as part of it. Contingency planning is part of, you might say, the planning process. You develop your plan at the very first start, but you consider what could go wrong, contingency events. Point 2 here, you start implementing your plan and you're scanning the environment. And if any of these contingency events are happening, well, first step is to identify them. You say, oh, I think perhaps we're headed towards an economic recession in the housing market. If you're a mortgage lender or a housing supplier, builder. Action point 3, okay, well, how do we know it's happening? Right? What are the signs that this is happening? And this is still at the planning phase, right? So we've identified what are the possible things that could happen. Okay, we've formally identified those things now. we've decided, well, what are going to be the hints that that thing is happening? So if we have a contingency plan for a recession, well, what would be, say, the indicators that we're going to use to determine whether we need to implement that contingency plan? If we say, okay, well, if growth slows to 1% a year, I'm just making numbers up here, then for us, that's going to be the indication that we need to start implementing our contingency plan for this event. Or if it was for a hurricane, right? Well, if the weather service tells us there's a reasonable chance we're going to be hit by a category 3 or higher, that's our indicator. Okay. And then the last point here is, well, we come up with the plan for that event. We've specified the different contingencies. So, and of course, you'd have multiple contingencies listed here. Each of them would then have sort of a formal identification. And then each of them would have their own indicators. The indicators for a hurricane are going to look different than the indicators for a recession, which are going to look different than the indicators for a pandemic. So each of these kind of branches out into different contingency plans. And then for each of those set of indicators, you're going to have a plan. And the whole time you're monitoring the environment as you're implementing your plans to see, are those indicators present, and do we need to start, in which case do we need to start implementing the contingency plan that we've created? So let's talk now about tactical plans. Very much a military term here. The strategy is the overall, if you might think of it, the overall plan for victory, and or maybe even including the victory objectives, right? Are we seeking a truce? Are we seeking a peace, or are we seeking total victory in the war? And then within that, okay, well, if we've decided to make an invasion or make some kind of push on one of our fronts, how do we plan to do that? What are the tactics we're going to use to achieve those strategic goals? The strategy informs the strategic goals. The tactics are about how do we achieve those strategic goals. The tactics are winning the battle. It's often said the strategy is about winning the war. I won't go into great detail here, but it's in the slides for you to look at. Essentially, this is just a chart about how do we develop the tactical goals and then how do we execute them. We evaluate them, of course, in light of the goal, the tactical goal itself. We need to get the information and the resources, the information to inform that goal and the resources to allocate towards the achievement of that tactical plan. And then we need to be in constant communication, horizontally and vertically. We need to be talking to our other functions, right? The operations team needs to be talking to the sales team to see if the strategic sales targets are being met. Are we actually selling as much as we thought we would, or do we need to reduce our output to avoid making too much overproduction? And then also vertical communication as well. How are things going on the line? Is the CEO changing anything up at the high level? That information flow needs to be happening. Going back to that early slide there where you saw the sort of cycles of planning that were giving feedback loops at every stage. Tactical goals will tend to have time frames, as will strategic goals. But here you start to really, you're getting a bit more into, say, all right, what do we want to do and when do we want to achieve it by? What activities, what milestones are going to be happening here as we work towards our end point? And it involves people. We need to be able to get information both from inside the organization, vertically from the line, horizontally from other functions, but also from outside the organization. What's going on around us? Is anything changing in our immediate tactical environment? Has a new competitor opened up across the street that is going to have an impact on our tactical plans that requires us to adjust them? And that's the part that involves monitoring. We need to be constantly checking that what we're doing is actually working. Talking now about operational plans, that lowest level, if you like, of our planning hierarchy, the day-to-day uh, actions sort of on the front lines. A couple different types of operational plans. We talk about single-use plans. This is often where you'll be talking about program or project management. You have a building project or uh, a- an expansion, geographic expansion program. The only difference there between those two words tends to be the level at which they're used. Projects are slightly lower level in terms of resource allocation and strategic importance, whereas programs tend to be higher level use of resources and high level strategic importance. Large, less scope, and complexity. So, like I said, you might have a project. Let's say that you are an oil refinery, or let's say retail gas. You're retail gas, and you want to open up a new retail gas location uh, in a new city in your area. Well, single retail gas station, that might just be a project, right? It's going to have a budget. It's going to have dates for completion and milestones as part of that project and some contracting. Somebody's going to need to manage that. Um, on the other hand, if you're saying, well, we want to start retail operations in a completely new country, we want to expand from the USA into, I don't know, um, Venezuela or uh, Mexico. Well, that's going to be a program. That's going to be involve probably multiple projects, multiple single retail gas station locations, and it's going to be a longer term commitment to get that established. And it'll probably, and eventually, programs tend to, I mean, both of these eventually take on a permanency, right? The project is eventually finished, and that just becomes part of the company's regular operations as a new gas station in our example here. Likewise, with the program, eventually that program of expansion into Mexico will hopefully, if it's successful, become permanent, and then that becomes a division in our firm, a permanent division. So these are our single-use plans. Then we have our standing plans. Um, and like I said, oftentimes the standing plans may start as single-use plans, although not always. Sometimes it's an activity that will be predictably occur over a regular period of time. And it allows us to make decisions, hopefully better quality decisions and faster decisions. If it's a decision that we know we're going to encounter regularly, that our staff are going to encounter regularly across multiple instances, it makes sense to have standing plans for how we make those decisions. The most common forms, these are the standing plans are the ones that tend to exist in, say, employee handbooks or managers' handbooks. Policy being the one that we're most familiar with. What is our general response to certain problems? What is our policy, our refund policy, right? That's one that we're all familiar with oftentimes. What is Amazon's refund policy versus Costco's refund policy versus the refund policy for perishable items or software? Oftentimes you can't get a refund on software, but you can on hardware. These would all exist as policy decisions, right? We're talking about decision making. Other forms of standing plans would be operating procedures, whereas a policy is more about the principle that we apply to similar situations. Operating procedures relates more to how do we carry out certain activities. So if we're going to give a refund, if we've decided we do offer refunds up to 30 days, well, what are the circumstances in which we offer those refunds? How do we evaluate them? And then how do we issue the refund itself? That also, the nitty gritty there might actually be part of rules and regulations. Exactly. This is where sort of this is probably what your staff tend to be trained with. Well, what do you need to put into the till at Lowe's in order to issue that refund to the customer who's returned a can of paint? The fact that we're going to allow that refund to happen is part of the policy. The standard operating procedure might refer to how we verify that it is that policy applies and the questions we ask the customer. And then this would be, okay, now that we've decided we're going to issue the refund, what sort of process do I need to follow? Now, it's kind of a gray area, the distinction between standard operating procedures and rules and regulation. You might see these terms used interchangeably, but it's worth knowing. They both refer to smaller levels of standing plans. And they're, as it says here, narrow in scope. What is our standard operating procedure for issuing a refund? What's our standard operating procedure for evaluating a credit card application, right? And then once we've approved it, what are the rules about how we send that? Do we mail it to them? Do they have to come in person, etc.? Honestly, like I said, sorry, the difference between these two here is a bit of a gray area and just has to do with the relative size between them. The larger level, higher level standing plan will be the standard operating procedure, and the smaller one will be rules and regulations. So what are some of the barriers to setting goals and effective planning? Major barriers would just include bad goals or inappropriate goals. If we are a small mom and pop retailer and we set a strategic goal to be the largest global retailer in 5 years, that's probably an inappropriate goal. If it's maybe it's possible, but if we set goals that aren't realistic, those are going to be inappropriate. An inappropriate reward system, if we're tying reward to those goals that are not achievable, that's going to create some problems. If we're operating in a really dynamic and complex environment, if things are changing so quickly, that can be a barrier to effective goal setting and planning. If we are in an industry characterized by very quick innovation, big deal in, say, chip manufacturing or AI, advances in AI are moving quite quickly right now. It's a very dynamic field. It may simply not be appropriate to establish very specific 5-year goals because changes in the competitive landscape may make them irrelevant before we ever get close to implementing those goals. There can be resistance to change. Change is difficult and people don't like to change. Managers don't like to change, so we may have resistance to implementing those goals on the line or at various levels within the firm. Sometimes that can be managed. Sometimes it may require, oftentimes, when a CEO is replaced, the whole top management team will be replaced if a firm's performing badly. How do we overcome these barriers? Well, the more we know about what good goals look like and how to plan properly, hopefully that will avoid inappropriate goals. If we are communicating and making that a participatory process, it can give people, make people feel engaged and committed to those goals, which can help in these two areas. This can also help in both of these areas. An effective reward system can also help people get on board, right? If we make it exciting, a stretch, but it's tied to rewards that people find motivating, that can also reduce resistance to change and encourage people to want to be part of a goal-setting process. And of course, if our goals become a poor fit, we need to be able to revise them and update them, and that'll fix this problem here as well. And any number of these. In fact, I would say this one right here is in many ways the most important. When the situation changes, we need to be able to have a way of receiving that information and a way of evolving is not quite the right word. Adapting is probably the word I'm looking for. Adapting to those changes and making the necessary adjustments. How do we use goals as managers? Well, there is a whole concept called managing by objectives or performance-based management. And the idea here is that, say, every year, this is something I've done with my managers at pretty much every job I've had since I started working ages ago, where you would sit down every year and lay out, sometimes it's called a development plan or something else, but essentially you're setting out your goals as a staff member, and you should be shown clearly how those relate to the goals of the organization. Oftentimes, those goals will be set with respect to the goals of the organization, and you'll have sub goals that you're shown how those tie into those strategic objectives, and you'll be told with some broad sort of constraints what your options are and encourage to set goals. What do you think you can achieve this year in terms of sales growth, for example, in your market, or in terms of cost reduction, or output? All depends on what functional area you work in. But the idea here is that you invite people to establish those goals. If you're a manager, you invite those who you are supervising or managing to collaborate so they can feel ownership. And then you make those goals the basis upon which performance is evaluated at the end of the year. You say, okay, we set these goals. How did we do? And that both gives a voice or gives ownership and also defines success. At the end of the year, it's a lot easier. If you've ever had a job where you didn't set specific goals, or even been in a course where you don't know how you're doing because you're not even sure what success looks like. Well, this is all about management based by objectives is all about defining success and then evaluating whether we achieved it. In order for this to happen, it needs to go all the way up. Usually, if it's not happening in the executive suite, it's not going to happen or be successful at the lower levels. At the executive, if there isn't a culture coming down from the top that's goal-oriented and manages by objectives, it's not going to carry down to the bottom. People will be either held to goals that are unreasonable or they won't be held to account at all, neither of which is good. And of course, there needs to be alignment between the organizational goals and your goals as wherever you sit in the organization. So here's how this looks from a broad view, managing by objectives or the goal setting process. There's the just figuring out how we want to do this. Maybe we want to have some kind of annual cycle. What is the way that we'll have a policy for how we set goals? Maybe it's done annually. Who is it done with? Then we actually do it. We establish those goals. They are done in a collaborative setting that involves all of, and then this is where we really get the buy-in from our staff. We communicate those goals. We meet to discuss them. We meet to make sure everyone is clear on what the goals are and what the plan is to achieve them. If needed, along the way, maybe that takes some counseling. Maybe not everyone understands or wants to be working towards those goals or likes the way that they're going to be implemented. If possible, that can be helped with some discussion, or if there's difficulties being encountered as well. Well, how can we help you? I'm having a hard time achieving the goals we agreed on, Mr. Manager. Can you help me? Right? I've had that happen in many jobs. I'm struggling right now in hitting my sales targets. Can you coach me a bit? If you might call this coaching as well. And then what resources do you need? Maybe you need to have a travel budget so you can be traveling around and hitting up more potential customers in your area, etc. Then we review, say annually, quarterly, whatever, and then we decide how have we done or how have you done in your achievement of those management-based objectives, managing by objectives. This is a process. Yeah, this is worth, if you remember nothing else from this chapter even, remember this. This is how you want to be managing. If you don't have a goal, you're sure to hit it. Or if you, is something my father-in-law always says. If you haven't set any goals, you don't know what success looks like. You don't know how to evaluate your work. It's demotivating. It's confusing. It's good to set goals. Managing by objectives, I highly endorse. So sort of you might call this the bright and the dark side of goal setting. The strengths, it improves motivation. It enhances communication because we all know where we're going. At least we're on the same route, hopefully to the same destination. It allows us to define success and then measure success for performance appraisals. It keeps us from doing things that we don't need to be doing, right? It keeps us from pursuing goals that are inappropriate. It helps us identify talent. If we're defining success and then measuring success, we can then see, well, actually, who is achieving their goals quite regularly versus who isn't? Who's in that sort of that 80-20 rule, the 20% of the people that are doing 80% of the work? Who are those people or are responsible for 80% of our success, you might say? Who are those people? And it allows for the best way, you might argue, to monitor and exercise control as an organization. The CEO can set objectives and goals for divisions that then set objectives and goals for functional areas within the division that then set objectives and goals for the line, for the sort of frontline staff. And it allows for at each level, information about performance and achievement of goals can be passed upwards through reports and then fed back down through amendments to the planning and goal setting. What are the weaknesses? Well, poor implementation. Peter Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. If the implementation isn't happening because there's a poor cultural fit or something else happening, then that could be a great weakness and a great barrier. Lack of top management support. If the CEOs come up with a great plan, but it's not getting support, it's probably not going to get the resources it needs. It's probably not going to one great problem is when you see your strategic objectives, but you keep being given work that you can't see where that work actually falls within those objectives. I have these things that I'm told that I'm being evaluated on, that I'm ostensibly even maybe getting a commission on, but you keep tasking me with things that have no relationship to that. That can stem from lack of management support, or just poor planning, poor goal setting. Maybe we were given the wrong goals. Overemphasizing quantitative goals. Some goals are hard to measure. We want to be able to measure it somehow, but maybe we need to be flexible here. If we're going to measure your attitude, right? Your attitude at work. Well, how do we measure whether you have a good enough attitude when you're dealing with customers? Maybe we need to figure out a different metric. Maybe it needs to be more about customer satisfaction surveys than a subjective quantization of attitude or whatever. Being able to measure something is good, but not everything lends itself to easy measurement. And it can also, if we're too rigid and we don't acknowledge that the situation has changed, for example, maybe you were given some quantitative goals about sales and then COVID hits. Well, if we don't adjust those goals and we just stick to this quantitative target with it inflexibly, you're going to be demotivated because something changed and it became impossible for an external reason beyond your control to achieve those goals. And of course, if you were assigned goals without any input, or you were assigned goals that you don't like, either it may be the wrong job for you, you may be in the wrong part of the organization, it may be the wrong organization for you, but being told to do things that you don't want to do, something has to change. It's not going to work. It's going to lead to resentment and a lack of commitment. And the person might just be looking for another job, or might just start shirking, slacking off, whatever. So when it works, it should look like this. When goal setting is going wrong, this is what can happen. Arguably, even this is in some ways still better than not setting goals at all, because then you're, like I said, if you're not setting any goals, you're sure to achieve your objective, which is nothing. Good. All right. That is lecture 1 for week 3. I'll see you in our second lecture.